Hercule Poirot and the Last Breath in the Locked Cupboard, Chapter 1. The Scent That Didn't Belong. Lady Eugenia Marston arranged her dinner parties like a chess game. Each guest was a carefully selected piece. Every word in the conversation, a premeditated move. That evening, at her mansion in Highclere Vale, the 35th birthday of her niece-in-law, the charming but reserved Clarissa, was being celebrated. The dinner was intimate, as Lady Eugenia preferred. Only 8 people, including Clarissa's young fiancé, the handsome but shy Dr. Lionel Bates. The dining room was lit with antique candelabras, and the white linen tablecloth looked even whiter. In the golden light, conversation flowed amid laughter, forks, and sidelong glances. But there was tension at tension. Clarissa tried to conceal, delicately gripping her wineglass, as if trying not to break it or drop it. Among the guests were retired Colonel Hugo Spence, a close friend of Lady Eugenie's late husband, Miss Violet Green, Lady Eugenie's personal secretary, who always wore a resigned expression, the family lawyer, Mr. Carfax, and finally, Mr. Ambrose Little, a writer of Gothic novels who seemed to enjoy the evening's drama a little too much. At a quarter to 11, after the dessert of pears and wine, Lady Eugenie rose with the precision of a metronome and announced it was time to retire. The Marston family has never been fond of insomnia, she joked, and everyone laughed subdued lie. At 11 o'clock, a maid screamed. Clarissa's body lay inside the upstairs wardrobe, in the guest room she'd been using since her fiancé's arrival. Her silk dress still gleamed in the dim light from the hallway. The closet door had been locked from the inside, somehow. Her face wore a serene expression, too serene. The only detail out of place was a stain on the lapel of her robe, a drop of perfume, intense and masculine. The local inspector, the robust and well-intentioned Inspector Barnaby, was immediately summoned. He quickly declared it a tragic suicide by self-confinement. The wardrobe door opened from the inside, but the bolt was engaged. A sad case, but a simple one, he said. Probably fiancé trouble. Lady Eugenia was not convinced. 3 days later, Hercule Poirot arrived by train from London, accompanied only by his ivory walking stick and his devotion to order. A locked closet, a beautiful woman, and a drop of men's perfume on her lace collar. "And you say suicide?" he murmured as he walked slowly along the carpet leading to the murder room. My friend, if the English knew how to observe, crime would disappear out of boredom. Poirot leaned in front of the wardrobe, examining the lock with an arched eyebrow. He took out a handkerchief, ran it over the handle, and then sniffed the air carefully. "Mrs. Marston," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving the wardrobe. "Have you noticed, by any chance, if any of the gentlemen in our party wore a perfume that was too strong, perhaps with oriental notes?" Lady Eugenia hesitated. "Now that you mention it, Mr. Little has exotic tastes. He says they inspire his writing." Poirot nodded. He walked silently to the bureau where Clarissa's personal effects were stored. He took out a half-open letter with no return address. His face changed only slightly, like a faint crease in a well-ironed sheet. "Inspector," he said to Officer Barnaby, "allow me one request. No one is to leave this house. We have not yet heard the real sigh, Miss Clarissa's last breath." Barnaby shrugged, irritated, but without argument. Lady Eugenie, for her part, understood. Immediately. She knew that when Poirot spoke of sighs, he wasn't referring to the air one exhales, but to the truth hidden in the silences. And so, with the English countryside wind beating against the windows of the mansion, the real game began. The great Hercule Poirot, in his impeccable gray suit and perfectly polished shoes, set out to unearth the secrets locked not only in the wardrobe, but in the hearts of those who had shared that last supper. Chapter 2. The House Where Nobody slept well. The day after Poirot's arrival began with a silence that was too thick for a house with so much history. Even the staff seemed to walk with the muffled steps of those who sense the air hold secrets. The Marston mansion hadn't been built for crime, but for preserving appearances. And yet, now it harbored a murderer, or so the celebrated Belgian. Detective firmly believed. Poirot had breakfast in the glass-enclosed gallery, as was his custom, where the sun streamed in unbidden. In front of him lay a cup of hot chocolate, 2 lightly toasted slices of bread, no more, no less, and a small notebook in which he jotted down observations, not so much out of necessity, but out of discipline that Lady Eugenia watched him from. An armchair with Florentine tapestry. I am honored by your presence, Monsieur Poirot, although I regret that circumstances have brought you here. Madam, circumstances are always inconvenient when they involve death. But believe me, they are also revealing. Have you discovered anything? Poirot raised an eyebrow, smiling with that gesture that suggested he had seen more than he was saying, but less than he still wanted to. I've discovered that in this house no one sleeps well. That's not unusual. Grief affects everyone. Poirot looked at her with a sweetness that barely disguised his scrutiny. I'm not referring to sadness, madame. I'm referring to the footsteps on the carpet at night, the cigarette lit on the porch at 3 in the morning, a soft but audible slam of the door near the north wing. Who sleeps soundly in a house where a young woman was found dead inside a closet, locked from the inside? Lady Eugenie didn't reply. Her steely gray eyes strayed toward the garden. Poirot didn't press the issue. Later that morning, the detective requested to speak, one-on-one, with each member present the night of Clarissa's death. The library was assigned as the interview location. Colonel Spence. He was the first to enter. His bushy mustache and still neatly ironed military jacket gave an impression of solidity, but Poirot was not fooled. What was your relationship with Miss Clarissa? Friendly, cordial. She was the niece of the late Lord Marston, a great friend. Of mine. I saw her grow up. And young Dr. Bates? Shy, intelligent, certainly, but somewhat retiring, even for my taste. Clarissa seemed, too, alive for someone like that. Poirot took note. Miss Violet Green, she arrived later, her hands clasped as if apologizing for existing. She was wearing a shapeless gray dress and spoke in whispers. Where were you at the time of Clarissa's death? In my room, reading. I go to bed early, sir. Did you hear anything unusual? A voice. I couldn't say whose. It sounded like someone pleading for something. But I thought it was the servants. What time? Maybe. Between 10:30 and 11. Poirot nodded. His face remained impassive, but his small gray cells weren't resting. Mr. Ambrose Little, for his part. He seemed delighted to be in such a melodramatic situation. He sat theatrically, as if expecting to be questioned by an invisible jury. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, doesn't all this seem like something out of one of my novels? A beautiful lady, a locked wardrobe, a secret love. Mr. Little, Poirot interrupted. With curt courtesy, please put fiction aside. Where exactly were you when the scream was heard? I was strolling down the East Wing corridor. I had left a letter on Lady Eugenie's desk. Miss Clarissa asked me to deliver something to you privately last night, but I didn't think it prudent. She didn't want any scandal. What kind of something? A personal letter. He entrusted it to me, but I didn't read it. Poirot remained silent for a significant moment. Then he noted, an attempt at blackmail or protection? Dr. Lionel Bates, he was the last one. Dark-circled, his jacket disheveled, and his voice wavering. I loved her, Monsieur Poirot. She had told me she was hesitating, that she didn't know if marrying me was the right thing to do. But I didn't imagine she would take her own life. And you believed it? Bates hesitated. He looked down. No, not entirely. Clarissa was afraid of something. She didn't tell me, but every time the phone rang, she flinched. Poirot leaned towards him, as if sharpening the air with his voice. Have you ever asked him if that fear had a name? Yes, Bates said in a whisper. And once, just once, he said it. He, Poirot, closed his notebook. When the day was over, he retired to the main hall. On the marble mantelpiece, Lord Marston's portrait regarded him with motionless disdain. The detective remained silent for a moment in front of the gilded mirror. A dead young woman, a locked wardrobe, a misplaced perfume. And everyone is afraid, but no one says why. No, this isn't a suicide. This is a message, enclosed in velvet, sealed with lies. Poirot straightened his handkerchief in his pocket and looked at the reflection of the house behind him. And I, Hercule Poirot, am here to hear the sigh that has not yet been uttered. Chapter 3. The Liar's Perfume. The next morning dawned with a pale mist creeping across the Highclere Vale gardens like an unwelcome memory. Poirot, punctual as the pendulum of a Swiss watch, was already at the crime scene before the first servant dared to climb the stairs. Clarissa's room remained untouched. Lady Eugenie had ordered that nothing be touched until Poirot gave his approval. In the center, the wardrobe remained like a wooden mausoleum, its lock still bearing the discreet imprint of mystery. Poirot inspected the room again, this time with a slower, almost meditative thoroughness. The carpet showed fresh marks, a slight indentation by the mirror. It didn't match Clarissa's heels or Dr. Bates's evening shoes, whose soles Poirot had already secretly examined. They were heavier footwear, perhaps masculine, but they had been moved with care. On the dressing table, among the perfumes and makeup bottles, there was a small, square bottle with a gold cap. It didn't match the rest. Poirot uncorked it with a handkerchief. The scent was oriental, penetrating, with notes of sandalwood and amber. He held it to his nose, frowned, and murmured, "Too bold, and too alien to this room." That same aroma, although fainter, still floated in the wardrobe. That afternoon, Poirot asked to speak with Mr. Ambrose Little again. This time he received him in the conservatory, surrounded by ferns and stained glass. Windows that cast lights like church windows. Little seemed uncomfortable, more serious than before. "Mr. Little," said Poirot without preamble, "is this your perfume?" The writer narrowed his eyes at the bottle Poirot held out to him. At first, he didn't respond. Then, in a dry voice, he confessed, "Yes, I've been using it for years." "They import it from Morocco." "So what?" "It was found in Miss Clarissa's room." "That doesn't prove anything." "It could have been planted by anyone." Poirot didn't reply. He just watched. A second, 2, 3. Then, with an almost invisible gesture, he adjusted his mustache and said, "Are you sure she didn't contact you before her death?" "I am," Little snapped. "All I received was a letter a few days ago, but it wasn't personal. It asked me to intercede with Lady Eugenie on a certain matter regarding the will. Nothing more." Poirot tilted his head. "Didn't you mention it as personal yesterday?" Little swallowed. A shadow crossed his face. "I was mistaken," he replied. "It was a brief letter, with no sentimental implications." Poirot put the bottle back in his handkerchief. "I appreciate your honesty." "For the moment." Later, Poirot added, "To the servants' wing, where Margaret, the maid, was waiting for him nervously. She had been the one who found the body." "Miss Margaret," Poirot said softly, "you were the first to enter the room that night. Did you notice anything strange, apart from the obvious?" The young woman hesitated. She looked around, as if afraid. The walls could hear. There was a handkerchief on the floor next to the wardrobe, a men's one. It smelled just like that perfume, but when the inspector arrived, it was gone. Someone must have picked it up. Poirot nodded. He didn't press any further. He offered her a reassuring smile and left Dot in Lady Eugenie's office. Poirot spent the latter part of the afternoon reviewing legal documents with the hostess's permission. It was there that he discovered something curious, a clause recently added. To Lord Marston's will, Clarissa would receive a considerable sum if she married before her 35th birthday. The deadline was in 3 weeks, and what's more, if she didn't marry, the sum would go directly into the hands of her legal guardian by cumulative inheritance. An ambiguous legal figure in that context, who was none other than Lady Eugenia. Poirot raised his eyebrows and closed the document with great care. Ah, voila! Money isn't always the motive, but when it appears, it colors the fabric of crime with a very opportune hue. That evening, Poirot walked down the central corridor, his cane in hand. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. In front of Clarissa's portrait, hanging in the music room, the detective stopped. She was smiling with that ambiguous expression between resignation and irony. "My poor girl," Poirot murmured. "You hid in a cupboard, but not out of fear. You were locked away, yes, but not of your own free will. And the culprit isn't a raging monster, but someone who is afraid of losing what they should never have had." He turned toward the darkness of the hallway, where a silhouette was silently watching him. "Good evening, madame," he said without turning around completely. "The next time we walk down this corridor, it will be to gather everyone together and hear what really happened that night." And the figure, without saying a word, disappeared into the shadows. Chapter 4. The missing letter in the letter. The next morning, the weather changed with a dramatic effect that seemed deliberate. The clouds hung heavy and low over Marston Manor, and the wind moaned at the cornices as if the house itself were protesting the secret it still held. Poirot, however, seemed unaffected by the weather or the thick air of suspicion that had settled among the inhabitants. Dressed in a light gray coat, he strode briskly toward Lady Eugenie's private office. There, on a silver tray, lay the correspondence that had belonged to Clarissa. Poirot asked permission to examine it more closely, and Lady Eugenie, with a slight inclination of her head, granted it without question. He studied her for a few seconds before beginning, and for the first time detected in her eyes a shadow, not of sadness, but of calculation. In the collection of letters, arranged with rigorous precision by Miss Violet Green, one stood out for its inaccuracy: a sheet of unlettered paper, with slightly faded black ink and handwriting that at first glance seemed imitated. It was supposedly a letter written by Clarissa days before her death, addressed to a J.L., with no other initials. It contained neither love nor resentment, only vague phrases about difficult decisions, family duties, and the idea of finishing what I had started. Poirot reread it twice. Something didn't fit. He took a small magnifying glass out of his pocket and bent over the word started. The ink, when it reaches the letter with, was tuned, and in decoration there was a slight change in the pen's pressure. But that wasn't the most curious thing. It was that in 3 sentences of the text, the commonly used letter E was missing, sometimes replaced by a meaningless I, or simply omitted. Someone had imitated Clarissa's handwriting, but they didn't know its inner keyboard, its rhythm. Poirot had seen enough of the young woman's actual notes to know that. "This wasn't written by Clarissa," he murmured. "It was written by someone who wanted us to think she did it, but she did it in haste, and fear. Fear always spoils handwriting." Later, Poirot walked with gentle steps toward Dr. Bates's office, where he was sorting through medical papers with trembling hands. The young man seemed distraught, not with grief, but with the weight of an unspoken truth. "Doctor, a simple question," said Poirot. Did Clarissa ever write you a letter after your engagement? Yes, one. He handed it to me. But he didn't talk about love. He said he wanted out of the engagement, that it had all been a mistake. Did you keep that letter? I broke it. Did you break it? Or was it taken from you? Bates looked up sharply. His lips trembled. I showed it to Mr. Carfax, the family lawyer. He told me it was best to destroy it, that it would be of no use after her death, that it would only cause harm. Poirot thanked him and withdrew. He said nothing more, but a dim but steady light lit up in his mind. Attorney Carfax didn't speak lightly, and even less did he advise destroying evidence. At tea time, Poirot asked to speak to Miss Violet Green. This time he summoned her to the music room, where the atmosphere seemed more conducive to his inquisitive tone disguised as politeness. Violet arrived with a notebook under her arm, as if she needed something in her hands to keep from collapsing. Miss Green, I need you to confirm something. Do you recognize this handwriting? He showed her the letter, supposedly written by Clarissa. Violet looked at her quickly, her face taut like a rope. It sounds like yours, but ... Not quite. Clarissa wrote with more ... grace. I thought so, said Poirot. Do you know of anyone who had access to your personal papers in the days before your death? Violet hesitated for a second. Yes. Lady Eugenie reviewed several documents on Clarissa's desk. She said it was related to the will. And Lawyer Carfax? 2. They were together when they did it. Poirot jotted something down in his notebook. Then, with a friendly smile, he stood up. Thank you, mademoiselle. You've been very helpful to me. Not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't mean to say. That evening, as the mansion settled into its ritual silence, Poirot went out into the conservatory. He had asked not to be interrupted. With him, he had the bottle of perfume found in Clarissa's room, the forged letter, and an empty envelope. There, by the dim light of a portable lamp, Poirot mentally rearranged the pieces. Clarissa hadn't committed suicide. He'd known it from the very first day. The bottle wasn't a forgotten ornament. It was an inadvertent signature, a careless act. And now, the letter. Confirmation that someone was trying to steer the story toward suicide, with ink that was too clumsy and words that were too measured. But there was still one question left unresolved. Why was Clarissa afraid? Poirot lifted the empty envelope. In the bottom corner was a barely visible letter R, an initial. It didn't match anyone in the house, ... except for Lady Eugenie's maiden name, Rutherford. Poirot slowly closed the envelope and muttered, Clarissa's fear wasn't of the future, but of the past, of what she knew. And what she knew was enough to die. The storm hit shortly before midnight. As thunder shook the windows. Poirot stood up, took up his cane, and called the service to gather everyone in the main hall. The time had come for every lie spoken to have its echo, and every omitted word its judgment. Chapter 5. The cane next to the piano, the main hall of Hercule. Vale slowly filled to the rhythmic sound of rain pounding against the windows like a funeral metronome. No one said a word as Poirot, with his usual composure, took his place standing beside the black grand piano that decorated the left-hand corner of the room. The fire crackled in the grate, casting trembling shadows over the tense faces of those present. Lady Eugenia arrived last, wrapped in a dark velvet coat. Her gaze was cold and elegant, as if even suspicion dared little with her. She sat next to Colonel Spence, whose hands rested on his carved ebony cane. Violet Green huddled on the edge of the sofa, her face pale, and Ambrose Little fiddled with his silver rings with barely concealed anxiety. Young Dr. Bates, on the other hand, remained standing, staring at the floor with dull eyes. Poirot broke the silence gently. My lords and ladies, I thank you for your presence this evening. I promise not to prolong my remarks, except as necessary. A crime has been committed under this roof. One that has not only extinguished one life, but threatens to poison many more. And as always, I beg your patience. Truth, when laid bare, demands a certain ceremony, but no one spoke. Only the wind. Let's start with the quietest, and yet most revealing. Object in this house, Poirot continued, pointing to a corner next to the piano. This walking stick. Everyone looked. The cane, which had until then gone unnoticed, rested against the wall, a few inches from the piano bench. It was simple, made of varnished wood, with a curved handle and a faint mark near the base. A recent mark, it seemed. Last night, during my walk, I found this cane out of its usual place. It doesn't belong to me, nor to any of the household staff. But it was seen on the morning of the murder by one of the maids ... in Clarissa's room. Ambrose Little opened his mouth, but said nothing. Lady Eugenie lowered her chin slightly, though her eyes didn't blink. Poirot continued. But the cane, of course, doesn't kill by itself. It's only a witness. What intrigued me was the stain near the end, a mixture of wood dust and wax. Where is that wax? Only in 2 rooms. The library, where the floor is polished every week, and the music room. In other words, this cane has been displaced. Unintentionally or unknowingly, Colonel Spence cleared his throat. That cane isn't mine, he said in a deep voice. Mine is with me, always. The one you have has a curved handle, and mine is straight. Poirot nodded slowly, as if he had expected this statement. Then he looked at Lady Eugenie. And you, madame, do you recognize this cane? No, he said coldly. I've never seen it before. Funny ... because your initial is engraved under the handle. A small R, almost erased. From when you were still Rutherford. A thick silence fell over the room. Even the fire seemed to dwindle. Lady Eugenia inhaled carefully. That cane belonged to my late husband. I never used it. Ah, but he did keep it. And someone took it from his study the night of the crime. Why? Not to walk with, not in the rain, but to use as a support. As he approached a locked wardrobe, in silence, Poirot took a step forward. His voice now took on a slightly firmer tone. The crime was silent, but not improvised. Clarissa was tricked into going to her room earlier than usual. Someone convinced her to wait there, with a forged letter written in a trembling hand and with fear in every line. And then, locked in her own closet, where she was given a dose of poison by inhalation. No wounds, no struggle. Just a tampered-with perfume bottle, where the scent masked the real poison. Poirot's eyes fell on Ambrose Little. Did you know that perfume could be altered with an oily base and a volatile poison? Did you read about it in one of your books? Ambrose paled. That's fiction. I never touched that bottle. And yet it's yours. You gave it to Clarissa secretly, didn't you? How do you know? Because the bottle's cap had been tampered with, and at the bottom, a label still remained with his personal monogram. Ambrose slumped slightly in his chair. Poirot walked slowly to the piano. And yet, you're not the murderer, Monsieur Little. You were manipulated. Someone needed your perfume at the scene. Someone with access to Clarissa's room, with knowledge of the will, and with personal motives to prevent her from marrying. Lady Eugenie watched him impassively. Her voice, when she spoke, was pure ice. Are you implying that I'm not implying, madame. I'm concluding. You changed the clause in the will in your favor. You knew Clarissa didn't want to marry, but she did plan to leave. She had bought a train ticket to London. She wanted to cut off everything. With you, with your guardianship, with your control. And that, you couldn't allow it. Lady Eugenia stood up slowly. Everything I've done, he said, was for her own good. She didn't understand the consequences of her decisions. She was weak, unstable. The Marston family couldn't afford another scandal. Poirot inclined his head. No, madame, I wasn't weak. I was afraid of you, and with good reason. Inspector Barnaby, who had witnessed everything in silence, slowly approached Lady Eugenie. She offered no resistance. She simply held out her hands with almost pathetic dignity. As she was escorted from the room, Violet Green burst into tears. Colonel Spence stood, motionless, staring into the fire, and Dr. Bates sat down, as if he could finally breathe after weeks of restraint. Poirot, for his part, picked up his walking stick next to the piano. He held it for a moment, and then placed it on the mantelpiece next to Clarissa's portrait. "In the end, mademoiselle," he murmured, "your last breath was not in vain." Chapter 6. The Silence That Nobody Noticed. Lady Eugenie's arrest, though carried out with the most impeccable English formality, left behind a trail of confusion, resentment, many doubts. Marston Manor still stood, but now seemed like a hollow shell. The stately architecture that had served for generations as a symbol of stability and prestige suddenly felt uneasy, as if the walls knew they had been silent accomplices in a tragedy. Poirot, however, did not seem satisfied, while Inspector Barnaby wrote his report with the speed of someone hoping to close a case before the clouds shift. The Belgian detective stood in the glass-enclosed gallery, facing the window, gazing at the mist that still clung to the garden. His reflection, like a ghostly double, stared back at him through the glass. "Not everything fits. No ... he murmured. Lady Eugenie had her reasons, yes. She had the opportunity. But she didn't have the improvisation. And this was improvised. Later, that morning, Poirot asked everyone present to reconvene in the library. Although Lady Eugenie was no longer in the house, something was bothering him. An unresolved note, a mistuned string in the concert of logic. Everyone came without protest. Ambrose Little, still pale but somewhat relieved, was the first to speak. "If we already know who did it, why have another meeting?" Poirot turned to him slowly, as if he had anticipated the question. "Because it's not over, monsieur. Not completely. You see, the logic of this case made sense. And yet, there's a thread that no one has noticed. A silence. Or rather, the absence of something that should have been heard." "What do you mean, Poirot?" Colonel Spence intervened firmly. "Screaming, Colonel. The maid Margaret said she screamed when she found the body, but no one, absolutely no one, heard Clarissa's scream. Not a single witness mentions it. A woman locked in a closet who dies within minutes, and no one hears a sound. Not a knock, not a struggle, nothing. Dr. Bates frowned. Was he unconscious, perhaps? Poirot shook his head slightly. Maybe, but not poison, or at least not only that. A forensic doctor who worked with me in London analyzed the substance found in the perfume bottle. It wasn't lethal, at least not immediately. It caused disorientation, weakness, even partial paralysis. But not death. The silence in the room became dense. "So?" Violet Green asked, barely audibly. Poirot looked at her with a sweetness that seemed the touch of pity. "So, mademoiselle, Miss Clarissa was alive when she was locked up, and someone made sure she couldn't call for help, because someone knew she wouldn't scream." "That's absurd," Little exclaimed. "Are you saying that she consented to being locked up?" "No," replied Poirot, without raising his voice. "I'm saying that he couldn't speak, that his voice had already been silenced before the wardrobe door closed. And do you know who knew it?" Poirot's eyes then fell on the one person who had remained invisible throughout the case. Not in body, but in essence, Miss Violet Green. She... lowered her gaze. Poirot took a step towards her. You, mademoiselle, knew that Clarissa suffered from episodes of hoarseness under extreme stress. You were the one who accompanied her to the boarding school where she suffered that trauma. You knew that if anyone frightened her enough, she would temporarily lose her voice. Violet covered her mouth with one hand. No, I never wanted ... I didn't mean to kill her, no. That was someone else's doing, but you helped. You locked her up, perhaps on orders, or perhaps out of fear. You weren't an accomplice, Miss Green. You were just another victim. But you were also a witness who chose to remain silent. Inspector Barnaby, who had been taking notes until then, sat up suddenly. Are you claiming that Lady Eugenie did not act alone? Poirot nodded. Exactly. And what's more, Lady Eugenie didn't tamper with the bottle. She didn't have access to the ingredients or the knowledge. But someone did. His eyes moved slowly to Dr. Bates. The young man stood up suddenly, white as a sheet. That's ridiculous. I loved her. That's exactly why. You loved her, and she was leaving. She was going to break the engagement. She was going to leave you, leave this life. And you, in a moment of desperation, prepared a jar ... just to weaken her, to make her doubt, so she couldn't leave that night. Bates shook his head violently. I didn't mean to hurt him. I wanted him to stay, but she didn't stay. She died. And when you realized what you'd done, Doctor, you accepted that Lady Eugenia took the blame. Because she, in her twisted way, wanted to protect you. She saw you as a grandson. You, for your part, decided to remain silent. Let her bear the burden. The silence was absolute. Bates slumped back in his chair, tearless, speechless. Violet Green sobbed. Ambrose Little discreetly retreated to the window. Poirot turned to Barnaby. Now then, Monsieur l'Inspecteur, the crime has been solved. All its perpetrators, visible and invisible, have been unmasked. Barnaby nodded, more serious than ever. That evening, Poirot packed his suitcase meticulously. Before leaving, he went downstairs once more to the drawing room. Clarissa's portrait was still hanging. The young woman looked different now, not so much because of the frame, but because the truth was no longer hidden under layers of silence. Poirot bowed slightly. Sometimes, mademoiselle, the crime isn't in the noise you make, but in the silence that everyone chooses not to hear. And with that thought, the detective said goodbye to Highclere Vale, leaving behind not only a quieter home, but a subtle echo that, in time, perhaps, would lead others to speak. Chapter 7. The garden that remembered too much. The next day dawned unusually clear, as if the weather, oblivious to the human tragedy, had decided to grant a luminous respite to the landscape. The fields surrounding Highclere Vale shone with the dampness of the freshly fallen rain, and a wild perfume rose from the garden hedges. The same garden Clarissa used to wander through every morning before breakfast. And although the police had left and Lady Eugenie's name was beginning to discreetly disappear from the staff's conversation, the air remained charged, as if the truth, far from dissipating, had sunk into the earth. Poirot has not left yet. A house can lie, he said, putting on his gloves. But a garden ... a garden always remembers. With his cane and hat, he slowly descended the stone steps that led to the path that bordered the greenhouse. He was accompanied by Colonel Spence, who had offered to show him around in a gesture that was half courtesy and half need for redemption. Clarissa came here often, the colonel said, pausing beneath a climbing rosebush. She said the garden was the only place in the house that didn't judge her. Poirot nodded without answering. He walked as if questioning the ground, observing the edges of the path, the arrangement of the flower pots, the orientation of the wrought iron benches. There was something a detail that had been bothering him since the previous evening, but which he hadn't been able to articulate clearly. In front of a semicircular stone bench, Poirot stopped. He looked at it carefully. The stone was still damp, except for one corner where there was a dark, dry stain. "Who sat here after the rain?" he asked aloud. Spence looked at him, puzzled. "No one. The garden has been empty since Clarissa was found." "So?" murmured Poirot. "Someone came before it rained, ... and came back afterward." He bent down with difficulty, and with the tip of his cane picked something up from the ground. It was a button. Small, mother of pearl, with a thin brass rim. It wasn't an ordinary button. It was ... identical to the coat that Ambrose Little had worn on the night of the tragedy. "Little?" Spence asked, guessing the thought. "Oui, Colonel Little, the playwright who claimed to live for mystery ... and yet was excessively pleased when the case was closed." Too eager to divert attention, Spence rubbed his mustache. "Do you think that ... I still don't believe it, but I'm bothered by your silence afterward, and your insistence that Clarissa had sought him out. What if that wasn't the case? What if it was all a setup?" Back at the house, Poirot asked Violet Green to help him sort through Mr. Little's belongings. Mr. Little was still staying as a guest while the police decided whether to issue a formal arrest warrant. Violet, though nervous, agreed. Ryder's small desk. Among papers with unfinished verses and letters to publishers, they found a blue notebook. In it, in green ink, he had outlined a new work. The title was The Final Breath, A Mystery in the Mists. Poirot read the first few paragraphs silently. The story was disturbingly familiar. A beautiful young woman, locked in a wardrobe, with a tampered-with perfume bottle as a weapon. There was even a character based on a fearful doctor, and a manipulative maternal figure. "When did you write this?" asked Poirot, without looking at Violet. "I ... don't know. But he'd had it with him since before dinner. I saw it in his coat pocket." Poirot closed the notebook carefully. So it wasn't a crime report. It was a plan. That evening, Poirot arranged to meet Ambrose Little in the music room. This time the atmosphere was different. There were no more spectators, no crackling fire. Only the closed piano, the shadow of dusk entering through the curtains, and the distant sound of a blackbird singing in the fountain outside. Little arrived with his usual air of theatrical smugness, but seeing the detective's expression, his voice became more cautious. "Did you wish to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Oui, one last conversation. Would you mind if we started with a simple question? Forward. At what exact moment did you know Clarissa was dead?" Little did not immediately respond. "When everyone knew?" "No, you knew about it before." "Because you wrote about it before it happened." Poirot threw the notebook onto the table. Little looked at it, blinked. "But he didn't touch it. That's fiction. Inspiration. You said it. The scene was Gothic. I just sensed it. No one intuits a crime with such precision. You had a plan, an idea, a story that needed a perfect ending. And you found in Clarissa, in her fragility and her situation, the ideal setting. You didn't kill her directly, but you did create the conditions. You convinced Bates to use the perfume. You manipulated Violet into locking Clarissa in the wardrobe, promising her it was all part of a harmless game, a test. And then you stepped back, waiting for the tragedy like someone waiting for a narrative climax. Little stood up slowly. For a moment, he dropped his mask. "I didn't touch her. Not once. And yet, he wrote his death. What kind of writer writes endings that come true?" Little gave a sad smile. "He who knows the world needs a proper closure. And Clarissa never knew how to close her chapters." Poirot took a step closer. "Nor you, sir. Because there's still one unfinished line. Justice. That evening, when Inspector Barnaby returned with the warrant in his hand, Poirot greeted him at the threshold with a slight nod. The garden told us everything, Monsieur l'Inspecteur. What the house didn't dare say. And as Little was escorted out, amidst murmurs of disbelief, Poirot sat back down on the veranda beside his cup of hot chocolate. He looked out at the now quiet garden and muttered to himself, a forgotten button, an untimely silence, an out-of-place scent. It's the details, always the details. And the human soul, as imperfect as it is fascinating. Chapter 8. The Confession That Was Not Heard. Ambrose. Little was discreetly transported in a district carriage while the servants looked out the windows with a mixture of stupor and relief. In the main corridor of the mansion, the faint scent of the incense Poirot had requested be lit still lingered, a custom of his, he said, to cleanse the air of poisoned emotions. But although the body of truth had finally been unearthed, Poirot was not satisfied. The truth hadn't been confessed. It had only been reconstructed. And that, for Poirot, was an unforgivable omission. That evening, when everything seemed to have calmed down, Violet Green asked to speak to Poirot privately. She found him in the library, sitting in the armchair, in front of the fire, leafing through an old volume of Montaigne's essays. He didn't turn around when she heard her enter, as if he had already known she was coming. Monsieur Poirot? He began in a trembling voice. I lied. He closed the book carefully. Ah, mademoiselle, everyone has. Some out of fear, others out of love, others for art. But you lied out of desperation. Violet stood like a paper statue. It wasn't Lady Eugenia who tampered with the will. It was Ambrose. He discovered the old clause and convinced me to help him alter it. I had access. He had the words. He was so persuasive. He made me feel seen. Why, Clarissa? Clarissa found out. She found the forged letter he dictated to me and confronted her. She didn't tell me directly, but I could tell from the look in her eye. She didn't trust me anymore. Then he told me that if I cooperated, everything would be resolved without harm, that he just needed time for Clarissa to come to her senses. He asked me to keep her in her room, to leave the perfume bottle with her, and to close the closet door, that it was a theatrical trick, a symbolic scene for his new novel. And you believed him? Violet nodded, tears in her eyes. I did it for love, Monsieur Poirot, a love that was never returned. Poirot watched her in silence. Then he stood up with a slow, ceremonious gesture and offered her a linen handkerchief. Mademoiselle. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. But it was also a human weakness. Your confession, though belated, is worth more than 100 pieces of forensic evidence. What will happen now? Poirot sighed. That, mademoiselle, is not for me to decide. But I can promise you one thing. You will no longer be a prisoner of your silence. May the law do what it must. But may your soul, at least, rest. The next morning, Poirot wrote a long letter to Inspector Barnaby, detailing Violet's confession, her role as an unwitting facilitator in the crime, and the true chain of manipulations that had culminated in Clarissa Marston's death. He recommended mercy, but not exoneration. Afterwards, he headed to the greenhouse once more. There, among the plants still damp with dew, he found Colonel Spence pruning a wayward vine. The man greeted him with a cordial nod, and together they walked in silence to the edge of the pond. Are you at peace with what happened, Poirot? The Colonel finally asked, peace. No, Poirot replied. But clarity, yes. Peace belongs to the innocent. Clarity to those who need to understand why the world went astray. Do you think Clarissa knew what they would do to her? Poirot looked out at the water. The reflection of the clouds was gently broken by every breeze. I think Clarissa sensed the danger, but she trusted even those who didn't deserve it, as all noble hearts do. And Violet? She will be judged, not for her actions, which were prompted, but for the moment she chose to remain silent. But she will also be forgiven if she knows how to face herself. The colonel nodded. Without adding anything else, at mid-morning, Poirot officially took his leave of the mansion. The servants offered him tea, which he politely declined. Instead, he accepted a wisteria flower hanging from a branch near the entrance, pinned it to his lapel, and set out toward the driveway where the inspector's car was waiting. Before going up, he turned one last time toward the large gray house. Once again, my little gray cells have served me well. But it's not logic that solves crimes. It's humanity. Understanding what people fear, what they love, what they're willing to lose. And with that thought, Hercule Poirot set off, leaving behind an empty closet, a remembered garden, and a truth that had finally been spoken out loud. Chapter 9. The letters no one dared to read. Despite his formal departure from Highclere Vale, Hercule Poirot did not completely abandon the case. From his room at the Langham Hotel in London, he maintained a discreet correspondence with Inspector Barnaby, with Miss Violet Green, now staying at a boarding house for ladies in Chelsea, and with a private archivist he had hired to research the legal documents prior to the modification of Lord Marston's will. He had learned that, in truly complex crimes, the truth does not always emerge at a scene, but between forgotten lines. A week after the official closure of the case, Poirot received an envelope with no return address. Inside, a letter written on cream-colored paper with gilt edges. The handwriting was shaky but refined. It was from Violet Green. Mr. Poirot, I've reread the letters Clarissa left me. I kept them out of cowardice, fearing their contents would condemn me. But now, after her death, I realize that silence is worse than being judged. These letters don't speak of fear or suspicion. They speak of love. Not for Dr. Bates, as we all believed, nor for Ambrose Little. They speak of someone else. Someone who was never mentioned during the inquest. They talk about a man named Marcus. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Marcus. The name didn't appear in any of the interrogations, nor in Clarissa's belongings, nor in the family members' accounts. She was, apparently, a deleted character. Poirot immediately went to the file he had sent for review. There, in the legal papers of the late Lord Marston, he found a minor but significant clue, a mention in an annex 10 years earlier of a certain Marcus. E. Rutherford. The last name stopped him. Rutherford. Mais oui, murmured Poirot, sitting up. Abruptly. He wasn't a stranger. He was a distant cousin of Lady Eugenie's, perhaps even ... old flame. Poirot sent for information. Marcus Rutherford, the archivist had discovered, had been excluded from the family after an unspecified scandal. He had gone to India and hadn't returned since. No one, until that moment, had connected his existence with Clarissa's recent history. But one sentence in Violet's letter chilled Poirot. Clarissa saw him 2 days before he died. They met secretly in the garden. He gave her a letter. I saw her hide it in the poetry book in the music room. After his death, I didn't have the courage to retrieve it. Poirot wasted no time. Accompanied by Inspector Barnaby, he returned to Highclere Vale for the last time. Lady Eugenie was still in custody. Dr. Bates had left the country, rumored to be headed for Canada, and Ambrose Little was awaiting formal trial. The mansion, in its stony silence, seemed colder, deeper. In the music room, Poirot went to the shelf by the window. There lay Clarissa's favorite books, Lord Byron, Christina Rossetti, Emily Dickinson. Poirot chose the most worn one, an aged edition of poems of John Keats. He flipped through it slowly, listening to each page as if he could hear the dead girl's breathing. And then, between the center pages, he found it, a letter folded in 3. The paper was yellowed from moisture, but the ink was still legible. It was a man's handwriting. Dear Clarissa, if you're reading this, it's because you decided to listen to your heart, not your blood. I'm not a man with the right to ask for anything, but I must tell you the truth. I am your father. Your mother left me when she learned what standing up to Lady Eugenie would entail. In exchange for silence, she forced me to disappear. But I never stopped looking for you. I learned about you by chance. I saw you in a photo in the newspaper. I came just to tell you that your life doesn't have to belong to them. If you'd like to meet me, I'll be at Marston Hill Station on Tuesday at 5. The letter wasn't signed with a last name, only Marcus. Poirot held the paper between his gloved fingers. Barnaby, at his side, murmured, "So it wasn't just money? It was identity, blood." "Exactly," Poirot replied. Clarissa had discovered that. She wasn't the daughter of Lady Eugenie's brother, but of a man who had been denied everything. And with that discovery, she became dangerous to those who had built a life on lies. They could no longer control her. Do you think Lady Eugenie knew? She feared it, no doubt. And I suspect it was Marcus who wrote the note she found before ordering Violet to lock the closet. Perhaps that's why she acted so abruptly. What she didn't imagine was that Little also manipulated shadows, or that Dr. Bates, in his weakness, would complete the crime that others had only planned. Barnaby shook his head, and to think that one letter could have changed everything. Poirot folded the paper and put it in his wallet. Letters, Inspector, are like locked-away confessions. They only reveal the truth when someone dares to read them. Back in London, Poirot met Violet Green for the last time, this time not as an accuser or a witness, but as someone who finally wanted to know the whole truth. He handed her Marcus's letter. She read it silently, her eyes moistening. Do you think she would have gone to the station? I'm sure she did, said Poirot. But she arrived too late, because someone detained her first. Someone who didn't want her to know what you and I know. No, Violet stared at the horizon through the cafe window, so Clarissa died of something more than poison. She died of the truth she wasn't allowed to know. Poirot nodded gently. And that's why, Mademoiselle, your story must be told in its entirety, not as a crime in the shadows, but as an echo of freedom that was silenced too soon. Chapter 10. The portrait that was never hung. In a gallery in the west wing of Highclere Vale, there was a blank wall, not by neglect, but by choice. The house archives contained a portrait commissioned more than 20 years earlier, an oil painting of a young mother holding her daughter, both faces soft and filled with autumn light. The work had been completed by a St. Ives school painter and shipped from Cornwall. But it was never hung. Lady Eugenie, upon seeing it, ordered it to be wrapped and put away. It doesn't fit with the style of the house, she said then. No one dared to contradict her. That painting, Poirot discovered days after reading Marcus's letter, was still in the attic, among covered furniture and forgotten chests. It was Miss Violet Green who led him there, with a measured step, as if guilt still clung to her heels. Clarissa showed it to me only once, she said, removing the cloth from the frame. I didn't know who the woman in the painting was, only that Lady Eugenie forbade its display. Poirot watched in silence. The woman portrayed had Clarissa's eyes, and her hair, and the expression of melancholic distance possessed only by those who have lived too long in silence. The baby in her lap, with a light lock of hair over its forehead, stretched a hand toward the light. That's your mother, isn't she? Violet asked. Yes, Poirot replied, without taking his eyes off her. And in her arms, no doubt about it, Clarissa. The painting wasn't hung because it didn't fit with the official story, because it was too ... true. Violet hugged herself. What do you do with something like that? It's hung up, Poirot replied, because houses that hide their portraits end up disfigured. With the help of the gardener and staff, the painting was removed from the attic, restored to its frame, and placed in the gallery. Poirot supervised every move, as if the placement of a painting were as critical as a crime scene. Perhaps it was. When he finished, he turned to Violet, who was watching from the doorway with her hands clasped together. Did you know who Clarissa's father was? Violet hesitated. I suspected. I saw a letter, many years ago, addressed to Lady Eugenie. It spoke of a blood debt and a broken promise. It was burned in the fireplace that very night. But I read it first. Why did he never say anything? Because I'd been taught that other people's secrets don't belong to us. And because I feared Lady Eugenia more than I feared the truth, Poirot didn't judge her. He just nodded, like someone who understands a chain too long to break with a single pull. A few days later, Poirot received an unexpected visitor. At his apartment in Whitehaven Mansions, the concierge handed him a handwritten calling card. M. E. Rutherford, Calcutta, India, now London Mayfair. Poirot wasn't surprised. He had anticipated that Marcus Rutherford would come. The man who entered was tall, with graying hair and a still firm back. His eyes, however, were those of Eamon, haunted by past choices. Are you the one who sought out Clarissa? Asked Poirot bluntly. Yeah. Are you the one who wrote the letter she hid? Yeah. Are you his father? Yes, he said in a barely audible voice, although I wasn't allowed to be. Poirot studied it for a few seconds. Then he stood up, walked to a display case, and took out a small wooden box. Inside, neatly folded, was the letter Violet had given him. She never destroyed it. She just hid it, just like you were forced to do with your name, Marcus Rutherford. Sat down slowly. Did he die knowing who he was? No. He died knowing there was a chance, and he fought for it. That, sir, is no small feat. A man covered his face with his hands. He didn't cry. He just remained silent for a long time. Finally, he looked up. Can I see his grave? Poirot nodded. She's been buried under the white elm in Hercule Garden, where she used to sit. Miss Green tends the flowers. The portrait has been hung up, and the truth, at least most of it, has been told. Marcus Rutherford stood up. He suddenly looked younger, as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, not for finding the culprit, but for giving me back a daughter I could never have. Poirot escorted him to the door. Monsieur, she said before dismissing him, there is no crime more painful than erasing someone from your history. You made mistakes, but you didn't forget them. That, sometimes, is enough to begin to redeem memory. That evening, as London grew foggy, Poirot sat by his window with a cup of hot chocolate. He opened his notebook and wrote the last line of the case. The crime wasn't the confinement nor the poison. It was the denial of an origin. And in that imposed oblivion, young Clarissa found her tragedy ... and her truth. He gently closed the notebook ... and for the first time since Highclere Vale, he slept without dreams ... Chapter 11, the inheritance that was never signed ... in the days that followed, while the newspapers quietly announced that a dark family case in Highclere Vale had been solved thanks to the intervention of a renowned Belgian detective. Poirot maintained a quiet, almost invisible activity. It wasn't the crime that kept him in England, but aftermath. The slowest poison was not the one that had silenced Clarissa, but the one that continued to throb in the documents, the properties, and the legal silences that surrounded her even after her death. And one of those silences lived in Lord Marston's will. One dull afternoon, Poirot was received in the office of notary Julian Carfax, the same lawyer who had participated in the family meetings prior to the crime. His London office, adorned with oak paneling and thick tomes on inheritance law, smelled of ink and irrevocable decisions. Carfax, thin and meticulous, greeted him with dry courtesy. "Monsieur Poirot, I didn't expect to see you again." "And yet, here we are, monsieur," said Poirot, sitting down, carefully crossing his legs. "I won't take up much of your time. Just a query about a clause, or rather, about an absence." Carfax narrowed his eyes. "Are you referring to the addendum on Clarissa's dowry?" "No, monsieur. I mean the second will. The one Lord Marston wrote before he died, and which was never signed." Carfax stood still. "There is no such document. And yet it exists. It was written by you yourself, wasn't it?" The lawyer swallowed. He stood up, walked to a filing cabinet, and opened it slowly. From it, he took out an unsealed envelope with a yellowed sheet of paper. Poirot watched him from his chair, without moving. "Lord Marston dictated that will to me in his last weeks," Carfax said quietly. "He wanted to leave Clarissa as his sole heir, to exclude Lady Eugenie, even from the administration. But he died before signing it. I kept it. I never destroyed it." Poirot leaned forward. "Because? Because I feared for Clarissa. And also ... because I feared for myself. Lady Eugenie was powerful. And Clarissa ... she seemed so confident. I didn't think she needed it. I thought the first will would be enough. It was a mistake. One that will cost me dearly." "Justice doesn't always seek punishment, monsieur," Poirot replied calmly. "Sometimes it only requires honest witnesses." Carfax slid the document toward him. "What do you plan to do with this?" Poirot did not touch it. "Nothing. It's not my responsibility. But I suggest you give it to someone who can still do something with it." "Marcus Rutherford, the biological father?" "Exactly. He has the right to know that his daughter would have been the legitimate heir. And perhaps, with that knowledge, he can repair some of what history denied him." Later, Poirot walked along the Thames promenade. Violet's letter, Bates's confession, Little's manipulation, Lady Eugenie's coldness. Everything had now formed a closed tapestry. And yet, a loose thread kept hanging. The ring. Clarissa was wearing a sapphire ring when she was found. A detail almost forgotten amid so many interrogations. Poirot had assumed it was part of her engagement ring to Bates, but the jewel didn't match. The description he himself had given of the engagement ring. Poirot decided to visit the mansion one last time. Violet Green received him with grateful respect. Together, they went through Clarissa's personal belongings that remained on her dressing table. There, carefully wrapped, was the ring oval, with a deep blue sapphire framed by 2 small diamonds. Inside, a nearly invisible inscription, "M to C always." It wasn't Lionel's, Violet said as she read it. "I never saw it in his hand before that week." Poirot stroked the edge of the sapphire with his fingertip. No, it was Marcus's. He had it with him when he came back. He wanted to give it to her. She took it ... and hid it. It was her proof. The sign that he was telling the truth. Violet took a deep breath. So I did know that he was her father. "I knew it," Poirot agreed. "But he never told anyone. The secret lived on in that ring, as it lived in that house, as it lived in all of them." He turned to Violet with a calm look. "Now there are no more secrets. Only stories to honor." That same evening, in a brief, discreet, and wordless ceremony, Marcus Rutherford placed the ring in a sealed urn resting under the white elm tree next to Clarissa's gravestone. It wasn't an act of mourning, but of restitution. Poirot watched from a distance. When he finished, he withdrew silently. Already in his room, he turned on the lamp, took his notebook, and wrote in his methodical handwriting. The unsigned was sealed Clarissa's fate as much as the poison. But it wasn't a document that betrayed her. It was the lack of courage in those around her. Only now, with her name cleared and her truth known, can she rest in peace. He closed the notebook, and as he always did when a case truly came to an end, placed a small dried flower on top of it, a wisteria flower. The same one that grew next to the gallery where Clarissa used to watch the sunrise. Chapter 12. Poirot's final comment. The London fog was thickening over the rooftops of Mayfair when Poirot finally allowed himself a day without commitments. He had no interviews pending, no witnesses to question, no documents to review. The Clarissa Marston case, as complex and human as an unfinished poem, had reached its conclusion. And yet Poirot knew, like every great observer of human nature, that no crime is ever completely solved. It only reorganizes itself in memory. That afternoon, after a short walk through Green Park, Poirot settled into his study armchair. His silk dressing gown, his cup of mint tea, and an envelope that had been waiting on his desk for a week. It had been sent by Marcus Rutherford from Devon, where he had retired after the ceremony at Highclere. Poirot opened it delicately. Inside, he found a handwritten letter in black ink and an old newspaper clipping. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I've done as you suggested. I've submitted the unsigned will to the court, not to claim inheritance, but so that Clarissa may be recognized for what she truly was, the legitimate daughter of Marcus Rutherford. The judge has agreed to include a legal note in the Marston family archives. It's a small thing, I know. But in this world, gestures that clear a name are sometimes worth more than checks that tarnish it. I also found a clipping she kept. I don't know if she ever read it. I'll leave it in your hands. Poirot held up the small yellowed clipping. It was an excerpt from a society column from years ago entitled The Secret Rose of Highclere Conservatory. It spoke of a young lady with a shy smile and a discreet personality, whose identity remained a mystery to the high society guests. A pious, almost lyrical note. The column ended with a phrase in italics. Some are born behind closed curtains, yet they still seek the light. Poirot read it several times. Then he placed it in his notebook, right at the end, as a sort of involuntary colophon. That same afternoon, Hastings, who had been in Scotland overseeing some family properties, returned to London and made his usual appearance at Whitehaven Mansions. My dear Hastings, Poirot greeted with a faint smile. Just in time for a final reflection. Is the case over then? Finished, yes, although closed. That's another matter. Hastings settled himself, as always, into the opposite armchair. And Poirot, with a slight sigh, began to speak. Not as a detective, not as an accuser, but as a witness to what the mind cannot always explain. You know, Hastings, this crime didn't begin with an argument or with jealousy. It began with an omission, an unspoken truth, a father forbidden to love, a daughter raised with questions instead of answers, and around them, people who believed naively they could shape an entire life without consequences. And what stopped them? Love, Hastings, or the lack of it? Miss Violet Green made mistakes because she confused affection with duty. Dr. Bates was weak because his love was possessive, not protective. Lady Eugenia, she didn't love. She only controlled. And Ambrose Little loved his work, not people. Poirot was silent for a moment. Then he raised his cup and sipped slowly. Clarissa, on the other hand, loved even. When she was betrayed, she accepted the man who claimed to be her father. She protected those around her, even when she suspected them. That's why her death wasn't a failure. It was a truncated decision, but not a final silence. Hastings frowned at him. And yet she died alone, Poirot. But not forgotten. And that, mon ami, is more than some people can say, even if they're still alive. 2 weeks later, the portrait of Clarissa and her mother was moved to the Berkshire County Genealogical Register Library, accompanied by a small poster that told her full story. Illegitimate daughter turned heiress, silenced by someone else's pride, redeemed by the truth. Poirot did not attend the ceremony. Instead, he wrote a brief note to the archive curator. Justice sometimes doesn't enter through the door of the courtroom, but through the window of memory. That evening, sitting in front of the window with the city alight beyond the glass, Poirot mentally replayed each scene. The locked wardrobe, the hidden letter, the cane by the piano, the lost button in the garden. And like a soft echo, Clarissa's voice, which he had never heard in life, seemed to whisper from the silence that had surrounded everything. I don't want revenge. I just want you to look at me without trembling. Poirot closed his eyes. We've been watching you, mademoiselle. And now, finally, no one trembles. Chapter 13. The voice that never had an owner. A week after Clarissa's portrait had been hung in the Berkshire Genealogical Library, Poirot found himself, against all odds, still not having left England. He had dismissed the case with his characteristic emotional order and meticulous logical conclusion, but something lingered in his mind like an unidentified murmur. It wasn't a doubt, exactly. It was an absence, the absence of Clarissa's voice. Had heard of her in all her forms, in the letters she left, in memories distorted by fear, in versions shaped by the interests of others. But never he had heard his own voice. His words, his choice of phrases, his personal tone, his way of looking at the world. For Poirot, this wasn't a trivial detail. It was the soul missing from the puzzle dot, and then he remembered something. A brief comment, lost among many conversations in Highclere Vale. Violet Green had mentioned it in passing, as they organized Clarissa's final belongings. A dictaphone, a gift from an old friend from Oxford. Clarissa liked to record her thoughts, she said. She said ideas were best heard when spoken aloud. Poirot immediately called Violet. She answered in a tense but hopeful voice. She confirmed that the dictaphone was still in her possession. She hadn't dared to listen to it, but that it was complete and in good condition. 2 hours later, Violet handed it to Poirot at his apartment in Whitehaven Mansions. The recorder was a compact, portable model, with 3 tapes labeled in fine handwriting, "Missed at Highclere, personal silences." For later, Poirot didn't hesitate. He chose the third option. Clarissa's voice emerged with a ghostly delicacy. Her tone was measured, like that of someone who didn't expect to be interrupted. If anyone's listening to this ... I guess I haven't managed to speak in life. What an irony. A house full of other people's words, and not a single one that belongs to me. Poirot closed his eyes. Clarissa's voice was clear, polite as expected, but also piercing, human. Lady Eugenia says that duty is the most important thing, that what one does in silence is more valuable than any scandalous truth. But I no longer want to be loyal to that silence. I want to know who I am, who my mother was, and why my father is a name erased from every document. A brief silence. Then a held breath before continuing. Dr. Bates. He loves me, yes, but he doesn't listen. He loves me as if I were an idea, not a woman. And Ambrose writes about me as if I were a tragic character in his novel, and he doesn't even know my favorite color. Poirot clenched his hands. On his knees, there it was, Clarissa's truth. Not the criminal truth, your emotional truth. I found a letter from someone who signs only as Marcus. He says he's my father. I don't want to believe it. I don't know if I can. But there's something in me that says yes, that there's something in his handwriting that recognizes me. Bet he sees me as I am, as I've never been seen before. I wish I could say this out loud, shout it, but in this house, screams aren't heard. They're absorbed, as if the walls were made of velvet. A pause, then a slight laugh. If something happens to me, don't think it was an accident. Don't believe the comfortable story. Check, doubt. And if you can listen to this. Because this is me. And I don't want to leave without at least one person having truly heard me. A final click of the recording echoed inside Poirot. The device fell silent. So did his apartment. He slowly got up, went to the window, and stared. At the city. Days later, Poirot handed a copy of the recording to the county prosecutor. Not as evidence, but as human testimony. He also sent a transcript to the Berkshire Library to be filed alongside Clarissa's portrait as part of the final file. And at his own expense, he commissioned a bronze plaque, discreet, elegant. It was placed at the foot of the portrait, beneath. The frame, Clarissa Marston Rutherford, 1902 to 1937. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to be heard. Excerpt from his last personal recording that same afternoon. Poirot received an unexpected letter. It came from an address with no return address, but he recognized the handwriting as soon as he saw the envelope. Marcus, thank you for giving me back my daughter's voice. I have no other legacy to offer except this promise. I will found a scholarship in her name for young women without a last name, without support, but with a voice. Because now I know what it costs not to be heard. Poirot smiled. Not a smile of triumph, but of repair. In his notebook, he wrote one last time about Clarissa. It was the case of the locked closet, yes, but more than that, it was the case of the life contained. Clarissa didn't die when the door closed. She died every time she wasn't allowed to speak. Now her voice lives on, and that, for a soul like hers, is justice. Poirot put away his pen. He closed his notebook. And he remained silent for a long time. Listening. Chapter 14. The Notebook. Where it all began. Winter was beginning to creep into London. The street lamps cast golden light on the damp cobblestones, and the shop windows of Piccadilly were already displaying holly wreaths and red ribbons. At Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot seemed to pay no attention to the season or the Christmas bustle growing around him. His attention was riveted on a small object, bound in burgundy leather, that Violet Green had sent him 2 days earlier. A notebook. It wasn't one of her monogrammed, deduction-filled notebooks. This one had the initials C.M. engraved in the bottom corner. Clarissa Marston. According to Violet, she had found it hidden in a slot behind the dressing-table mirror in Clarissa's bedroom. It didn't look like a typical diary. Rather, it was a mixture of reflections, unfinished thoughts, and surprisingly, small pencil sketches, unfinished portraits, silhouettes of trees in the garden, corners of the greenhouse, always seen from the same angle. Poirot settled into his armchair, carefully opened his notebook, and began to read. Today I dreamed the house had a voice. Not like people. It was a voice of wood, of silence. It told me not to move, that everything would be fine if I didn't break the order. But I wanted to run. I didn't know where. Just far away. Ambrose says writing is purging. But I think drawing is more so. When I draw something, I see it for what it is, not for what it's supposed to represent. Instead, when I write, I'm afraid of lying to myself. I heard Violet talking to someone on the phone. She's hiding things from me, not out of malice, but out of fragility. She's a prisoner here, too, one who's learned to make herself invisible. Poirot turned the pages slowly. The more he read, the clearer one feeling became. Clarissa had been struggling to exist. Every line was an attempt to assert herself, to resist dissolution under the influence of others. Lady Eugenia, Little, Bates, even Violet, all shaped her. All spoke for her Dot, and yet, in that notebook, her voice was unwavering. It was intimate, free. Clarissa unguarded. On his centerfold, he found something different. No text. Just a drawing. A spiral staircase descending into darkness, and on the bottom step, a figure with her back to us, her hair loose, a letter in her hand. Next to the drawing, a phrase. Where there is no name, there is no echo. Poirot closed. The notebook, not out of concern, but out of respect. It was the kind of silence that wasn't filled with answers, but with attention. The next morning, Poirot showed up unannounced at the Berkshire Genealogical Library. He asked to speak to the curator in charge of the Marston Rutherford section. He had the notebook in his briefcase. "Mademoiselle," he said with his usual courtesy, "I have an object that completes what you already have in your archive. It's not evidence. It's not a museum piece. It's a voice, an emotional truth." The curator, a woman with attentive manners and a soft voice, accepted it with the solemnity that the moment demanded. "Do you wish us to expose it, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot thought for a few seconds. Then he shook his head. "Not yet. Keep it. Give it, perhaps, one day, to a young woman who doesn't know who she is, who is searching for herself. Perhaps, in those pages, she will hear a voice like her own, and understand that." The echo comes after daring to speak. Back in London, Poirot returned to his apartment at dusk. Hastings was there, leafing through a book by the fire. Seeing Poirot enter, he stood up with his typical warm energy. "A quiet day, Poirot?" Poirot smiled. "Quiet, yes, but not empty. Are you still thinking about Clarissa?" "No, Hastings. I'm not thinking about the victim anymore. I'm thinking about the young woman she was, who tried to define herself, who wrote, drew, recorded, and whose greatest crime was not being heard when she could still speak for herself. And you think you did justice?" Poirot nodded with a different gravity. "Justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's a space, a recognition, a notebook that isn't destroyed, a portrait that's hung up, a surname that's restored. That's what we did, Hastings. That's what we did." Hastings remained silent. Then he poured 2 cups of tea. Snow was beginning to fall on the windows. In his personal notebook, Poirot wrote a final note on the case. Crime doesn't just kill. It erases. It disguises. It rewrites. But true souls leave traces. Clarissa Marston wasn't simply a victim. She was a mirror for those around her. And in her silence, she left questions that could only be answered when the echo found its owner. Again, he closed the notebook. He placed his pen on the table. And that night, for the first time since Highclere Vale, Poirot turned on the phonograph and let a soft, wordless melody fill the air. Chapter 15. The letter that saw the light. Hercule. Poirot's carefully organized life rarely allowed for uninvited surprises. However, in the 3rd week of December, as the city began to gather in the rush and glitter of the Christmas holidays, a small surprise arrived, not with bells or mysteries, but with the stealth of an ivory envelope slipped under his door. Poirot noticed it immediately. The handwriting was shaky but careful, with a long stroke on the T's and L's, like someone who learned to write in a convent or under strict discipline. There was no postage stamp or return address, just one name on the back. In LOWERCSE Cologne, Clarissa. Poirot took it delicately, carried it to his desk, and allowed himself something he rarely did, a pause before opening it. He took a deep breath, then carefully slid his small silver knife through the flap of the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in faint blue ink. The date, in the upper right corner, read October 20, 3 days before Clarissa's death. Mr. Poirot, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I doubt it, actually. I'm writing it more for myself than for you. I heard about you years ago. Violet once mentioned your name when she read a news story about one of your cases. She said you listen differently, that you don't look for the loudest words, but for the ones that sound out of place. That stuck with me. I'm not a particularly interesting woman. I don't have any extraordinary stories, but there's something weighing on me, and I don't know how to carry it without someone knowing. I know this house isn't what it seems, that Lady Eugenie isn't what she says, and that the future they're offering me is a silk-covered cage. My voice has no power, my presence even less. But if something happens to me, if I cease to be, if my silence becomes sudden, like a pit opening in the middle of the hallway, I pray that someone will not accept the easy explanation. That someone is more than seems necessary. I'm writing it down and leaving it here, among my papers. If it ever reaches your hands, then I'll have had a kind of luck. There was no full signature, just an initial. C. Poirot read it twice. Then, a third time, more slowly, not because of the content, which I had sensed long ago, but because of the intention. Clarissa didn't leave an emotional testament or a confession. She left a reading request, a plea not to be simplified, a tiny trench against invisibility. That same afternoon, Poirot traveled unannounced to Marston Hill. The parish cemetery, where Clarissa lay buried, was covered in frost. The bare trees formed slender silhouettes against the dull sky. In front of the modest, soberly designed gravestone, Poirot paused, his hands in his coat pockets. He took out the letter. He didn't leave it on the grave. He didn't bury it. The read aloud, once, no witnesses, no drama, just the words, just as she wrote them. When he finished, he put it back inside his jacket. "You're coming, mademoiselle?" he murmured. "We read between the lines, just as you expected." Back in London, Poirot wrote a note to Violet Green. Nothing long. Just a reflection, as a private epilogue for someone who had also been burdened with secrets. Silent truths are no less true. Clarissa knew what was happening around her. She understood. And yet, she chose not to report it. She chose to trust. Not in her family, nor in the justice system, but in the possibility that her story would survive her absence. Today I confirm it. She survived. Because someone knew, Violet dared to stop being invisible. And because others, albeit late, decided to listen, Poirot sealed the letter. He didn't mail it. He handed it to her one clear morning, while Violet was tending the flowers she had planted around the white elm tree. She read it silently. She didn't cry. She just nodded and crouched down again next to the earth, as if continuing to tend that. Garden was her form of prayer. At Whitehaven Mansions that evening, Poirot dusted off a box where he kept closed cases of personal value. Inside were Clarissa's tapes, the transcript of her unsigned will, the button from Little's coat, and a faded photograph of the portrait that had never been hung until now. He added the newly received letter. He closed the box with the brass lock. Then he poured himself a glass of cassis liquor, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. He had solved many crimes. But this one he had solved something in it. Chapter 16. The file that wasn't listed in any index. January arrived in London with a post-holiday calm, as if the entire city was taking a breath after holding its breath through December. Shop windows were beginning to take down their lights. Christmas trees were piled up on street corners like the remains of a dismantled theater, and the air, though chilly, no longer promised snow. Hercule Poirot, however, remained faithful to his routine. A cup of hot chocolate in the morning, a short walk around his neighborhood, and then several hours in his study, where he reorganized the details of the Marston case, not out of legal necessity, but out of a principle of his own. No mystery is closed until the last question has been asked. It was during one of those reviews that something caught his attention. Among the transcripts, Violet Green had made by hand at his request copies of correspondence, records from the Marston file, passages from Clarissa's diary. Poirot found a marginal note, barely a pencil stroke, in handwriting different from Violet's, rounder, less disciplined. The line read, "See Index E, blue folder, bottom level of Eugenia's closet." Poirot frowned. He remembered that wardrobe, one of the less remarkable pieces of furniture in Lady Eugenia Marston's private office. While the investigation had focused on the murder wardrobe, that dark oak wardrobe with its carved panels hadn't been examined closely. It had seemed innocent, inconsequential, and yet there resided a new echo. Poirot returned to Highclere Vale 2 days later, protected by a still valid court permit. The mansion was uninhabited except for a pair of temporary caretakers, hired to prevent its deterioration until the property's legal fate was decided. "I'm asking for just an hour," Poirot said to the caretaker, a man with a kind face and bushy eyebrows. "All I need is silence and a lamp." With his walking stick in one hand and a pocket flashlight in the other, Poirot climbed the stairs with determined steps. The air in the house had that peculiar scent of places rich in history, but poor in human presence. Closed wood, sleeping books, novel dust. In Lady Eugenie's office, the cupboard was still in place, locked, but the lock was simple. Poirot opened it with a small lockpick. He kept more out of foresight than habit. Inside, neatly aligned documents, numbered boxes, folders in green, red, and brown leather, and one, in the background, different, pale blue cardboard, without a label. Poirot carefully removed it and placed it on the desk. It contained only 3 items: a typed letter, signed with intertwined initials, M.E.R.A., somewhat blurry black and white photograph of a young woman wearing a wide-brimmed hat, walking backwards alongside a man with a cane, a handwritten, unsealed paternal recognition certificate, dated 1920, and addressed to the legal guardians of Clarissa Marston. The letter said, "To Mrs. E.R. Marston, you asked me for silence. You offered. Conditions. But time has passed, and I haven't forgotten. Clarissa has the right to know. You raised her like an inherited jewel, polished and locked away. I just want her to remind me that she's human, not a possession. I'll come, even if you don't invite me. Not out of defiance, but out of duty. I don't owe you obedience. I owe myself only to my daughter, me R." Poirot stood for a long time in front of the document. Each word was like a sharp blow against the marble of the official narrative. Lady Eugenia knew, from the beginning, it wasn't just a suspicion. It was deliberate knowledge. A secret with a name, a surname, and a context. And he didn't just hide it, he filed it. He classified it. He buried it in alphabetical order. The photograph, despite its blurriness, showed Clarissa's young mother, and Marcus Rutherford himself, still young, recognizable by the curve of his walking stick and the shiny button jacket Violet had described. In her memoirs, Poirot slipped the photograph into the report. Then he put everything back in the folder and took it with him. In London, Poirot requested an audience with the district attorney, not to restart the case, but to complete its legal and emotional dimension. He handed over the documents, explained their context, and made it clear that he was not requesting new positions, but rather that the Clarissa's files were corrected, expanded, and officially recognized. The prosecutor, after reading Marcus's letter and examining the recognizance certificate, nodded gravely. Documents rarely reveal more than interrogations. But this one does. Clarissa's voice wasn't the only one silenced, Poirot replied. Her father was eliminated with almost surgical precision, and her mother ... was turned into a nameless ghost. That operation must not survive the court case. A few days later, Poirot received a short note from Violet Green. "I've read the report. I've seen the photo. I've cried for everything I didn't understand in time. But at last ... everything is out in the open. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Not for solving the crime, but for unearthing the love that was also buried." Poirot folded it and placed it in his personal file box, next to the dried wisteria flower. Then he wrote, in his notebook, the last line of that story, "The archives of the heart aren't listed in any index, but they exist, and finally they've been read." Chapter 17. The flower that didn't appear in the garden at the end of February, when the first shoots were timidly beginning to peek out from the frozen earth of English gardens. A solitary figure walked through Highclere Vale with a slow but determined gait. Violet Green had returned, not out of nostalgia, nor out of administrative responsibility. Ownership was still in dispute, but for something more intimate, close its cycle in the place where a part of it had remained suspended. She was wearing a light gray coat, a simple scarf, and holding a basket. Inside, she carefully wrapped a small ceramic pot with a flower that didn't belong in that garden. A blue anemone dot. It wasn't a native flower. It had never grown along the symmetrical paths Lady Eugenie had designed, but Clarissa had drawn it several times in the margins of her personal notebook. Small, rounded petals with a black center like a pupil. In the drawings, it always appeared isolated, as if sprouting alone from a remote corner of the world. Violet had seen it so many times in the roll that she decided to look for it in the Oxfordshire nurseries after all. And finally, he brought her in the back garden, next to the white elm where Clarissa lay. Violet delicately dug a small hole in the ground. She did it with her hands, no gloves, no tools. The clay was damp, but not cold. The earth, like the truth, it didn't hurt anymore. He planted the flower right at the foot of the tombstone, aligned with the afternoon light. The anemone seemed fragile, but not defeated. A flower that, although displaced, would take root if left alone. Violet stood for a moment longer. "I knew you wouldn't let me erase you," he said softly. "You just needed someone, at least once, to look at you without fear." She took an envelope out of her coat. Inside, an unmailed letter. The last one Clarissa wrote before she died. It was addressed to her. Violet hadn't opened it in weeks. She'd been afraid of it. But today, faced with that anemone that didn't belong in the garden, she felt ready. He opened it and read, "Dear Violet, I know you're protecting me. You've been doing it for years. Like you protect a porcelain figurine, wrapping it so it doesn't break. But I don't want to be wrapped anymore. I want to break, if necessary. I want to know the man who came to the garden, Marcus. I know you know him. You don't tell me, but I can see it in your eyes. Is that him? Is that my father? You don't have to answer me. I just need you not to be the one who locks me up this time. I don't want to die without having chosen something, even if it means the pain of discovering everything. With love always." C. Violet folded the letter gently. She didn't put it away. She placed it under the pot, like part of the roots. Upon her return to London, Violet wrote to Poirot. Not a letter of thanks, not a closing letter. Just a brief, heartfelt note from someone who has survived a shipwreck without knowing they were in the water. "I have planted the flower, Monsieur Poirot. The one Clarissa drew, but never had. They called it the flower of abandonment in ancient times. But now, for me, it is something else. It is the flower that blooms when no one expects it." Poirot, reading it, smiled with a tenderness rare. For him, then he headed to his desk, where his black-covered notebook was still kept. He hadn't opened it for weeks, But now he felt one last note was necessary. The real crime wasn't just Clarissa's death. It was the denial of her will, her story, her right to be heard. And yet, she survived, not in the portrait, not in the documents, but in the flower that didn't belong in the garden, ... And that, at last, loomed. He closed the notebook ... He turned off the lamp, and for a long moment he stood motionless, watching night fall over the city. Not with noise, not with shadows, but as things fall, finally finding their place, silently, but without disappearing. Chapter 18. The name written in the light ... in the early spring, when buds were just a promise on the London branches. A sealed envelope was hand-delivered to the reception of Whitehaven Mansions. The concierge brought it to Poirot as he was having breakfast, promptly at 8 o'clock, with his hot chocolate, his roll, and his copy of the El Figaro. It came from Berkshire, the caretaker said, from the Marston Heritage Archive. Poirot took it with a slight tilt of his eyebrows. He opened it with surgical precision and extracted a sheet of paper signed by the legal custodian of the Marston estate. It read as follows: Mr. Hercule Poirot, we are pleased to inform you that, following a thorough review of the submitted wills, the late declarations, and the documentary evidence added by your research, Miss Clarissa Marston has been formally recognized as the legitimate daughter of Marquis Rutherford and the sole valid testamentary heir to Lord Marston's estate, according to the intentions contained in this second unsigned document. Since the estate cannot be delivered to the deceased, the Clarissa Rutherford Marston Foundation has been established under her full name and restored legal title. Poirot stopped, not out of surprise, but for something deeper colon repair. Not in a judicial sense, but in a human sense. He continued reading. The Foundation will fund scholarships for young women of unrecognized ancestry, with an emphasis on studies in history, writing, and archiving. The first location will be in Oxford. The signature flower will be the blue anemone. The name had a face. Silence now had a voice. That afternoon, Poirot went to visit Violet Green. He found her in her small apartment in Bloomsbury, where she worked as a filing clerk in a university library. She lived among old documents, but with a new lightness in her step, as if the perpetual shadow of her past had finally returned to her. They've made your name official, Poirot told him without ceremony. Clarissa Rutherford Marston. And with her, her mother's. And her father's. Violet absorbed this slowly. She nodded. She said nothing more. But she walked over to her desk and took out a small, dark leather case. She opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait, which I'd never shown to anyone. It was Clarissa's mother as a young woman. The same woman in the portrait that had been hidden in the attic at Highclere for years. But here, in this image, she was smiling. His name was Eliza Rutherford, Violet said finally. She was a governess before she was secretly married off. When Lady Eugenie discovered that her brother had compromised the family name, she sent her away and paid to have her name removed from the family records. But she failed to erase her from Clarissa. No, said Poirot softly, nor yours. A month later, in a low-key but moving ceremony, the Clarissa R. Marston Foundation headquarters were opened in a Victorian building on the outskirts of Oxford. Marquis Rutherford cut the ribbon. He was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a gray coat, leaning on an antique cane, the same one he'd been holding in the hidden photograph. He didn't say much, but when his moment came, he took a crumpled sheet of paper from his pocket, the transcript of his daughter's last recording, and he read a fragment. I don't want revenge. I just want to be heard, so that if I disappear one day, someone won't settle for a flawless version. His voice trembled, but he did not hesitate. Today that voice has a place, he said. And from here, others will too. Poirot was among the audience. Not at the front, not as a protagonist, only as an observer. His favorite place. No one formally thanked him. But Violet, from the second row, turned briefly toward him and nodded with a slight, knowing smile. That evening, back in his apartment, Poirot dusted off his personal file box. For the last time, inside were the pieces that had not become legal. Evidence, but which for him constituted the core of the case. The dried wisteria flower, Little's coat button, Clarissa's letter with no sender, the newspaper clipping, the secret rose of Hercule Conservatory, and in the background, the original tape with Clarissa's voice. Poirot held it between his fingers. He didn't play it, not this time. He didn't need to hear it again, because now others could do it too. It wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to History. In his notebook, he wrote the final words. A young woman was murdered, but not out of hatred, not even out of greed. She was murdered because of someone else's desire to write her life in her own name. Justice wasn't about arresting the perpetrators, but about restoring her name, her origins, and her voice. And, with that, restoring the echo that others tried to silence. Poirot closed the notebook. A glass of cassis liqueur was poured. And as the city sank into its nighttime rhythm, he said softly, looking out the window, "Adieu, Mademoiselle Clarissa." And that was the last word spoken in the case off last breath in the closed closet.